You're listening to Let's Talk Sustainable Business.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Let's Talk Sustainable Business. I will be continuing the conversation with Simon Hombersley, the CEO of Xampla. So, in our last episode, we talked about Xampla's technology and mission, and we also discussed Xampla's role in the supply chain, as well as how initially the products were inspired by nature, specifically how a spider weaves their webs and creates resilient protein material. So, after understanding a little bit more about Xampla, in this episode, we'll be discussing more about the wider issues of plastic pollution and how the actions corporates and consumers can take to mitigate this crisis. Hi, Simon. Welcome back to Let's Talk Sustainable Business.
Hello, Claudia.
So, thank you so much for sharing some of your insights with me regarding how you launched Xampla, as well as some of the specific applications of Xampla's plant material. And we ended last time on the issue of biomimicry, like how the product was inspired by nature. Um, and for this part, I would like to start off with actually quite an important issue, which is the pricing of your products. Because, as I understand, the reason why plastics is so commonly used is because it is one of the cheapest materials to produce, and because it is produced with the byproducts of crude oil, natural gas, and coal, which is what makes it cheap. And I'm just wondering, how do you and your team have a strategy in place as to how Sampla's products can compete pricing wise with these synthetic plastic products?
I think there's two parts to that. One is the price of plastic, and then the other is the price of our materials. I would just emphasize that you're right. Plastic started out as a byproduct, of the oil industry. Essentially, the industry was trying to find another use for this waste from its processes. As fuel use decreases over the next 20 to 30 years, actually the proportion of revenue that comes from the petrochem side of people's business is actually going to increase. Plastic is actually becoming increasingly important as a revenue stream to the oil industry. So it's no longer the byproduct, as it were. It's actually
Mm-hmm.
the main event increasingly. But the other part of the price of plastic today is that plastic has never been correctly priced. It's essentially, in addition to the tax breaks that the industry gets, the real cost to the planet of plastic has never been accounted for. It's a classic example of the externalities in a market not being recognized. And that's changing because governments around the world are actually beginning to tax and legislate and regulate. And that then will increase the price of plastic. So plastics are going to become more expensive. But nonetheless, you're absolutely right. Anything new trying to disrupt a very, very well established low cost commodity good is going to have a challenge on how we get to price parity in time. And price parity is important. Plastics is a scale business. If we're going to replace plastic with natural materials, it has to be competitive, cost competitive. So Zampla's strategy in the near term is to focus on entry points where the price of plastic is higher, essentially. So soluble plastics, the dishwasher tablet wrapper, which is made from PVOH. PVOH is quite an expensive plastic, and Xampla can compete against PVOH on price from the outset. Now, that's not the same for cheaper plastics, the sort of standard poly bags and so forth. That is to come in due course, and that's largely a function of volume and capacity. But in the near term, companies like us and others are doing this as well, can focus on doing high performance plastics, specialist plastics, interesting areas that are niche but still extremely large markets, which give us a starting point to get to scale before we start tackling those very large volume plastic markets.
I see. Yes, that does make sense as a business model to focus on those plastics where it's easier to reach price parity with. So I think also going back to your point about how the petrochemicals industry, because there are a lot of governments sort of phasing out on fossil fuels. I've read many articles about how the petrochemical industry is now pushing for plastics as their main source of income, and for companies to so basically continue supporting petrochemicals to produce plastics. Um, is is this then an issue or a big challenge for plant-based plastic substitute companies like Sampla?
Yes, I think that given the scale of these markets, there are plenty of entry points, and there's plenty of ways for us all to build businesses that then can scale in due course. So I'm not overly concerned in the near term. I think as a midterm, I think there will be a fight as we begin to transition. But I think what's interesting about other disruptive industries in this sector is everything is really, really, really difficult, and then suddenly there's a flip. And the classic example of that is you look at photovoltaic, so PV, solar panels. So
Mm-hmm.
when solar panels first started out, they were massively more expensive. There were, 15 years ago in the UK, certainly there were huge government grants available to enable that transition. That was the only way to make that business viable. And then suddenly you get to a point where those panels and the cost of those panels just flips into the point where it's a completely bankable prospect, and the offtakes are there, and then the cost economics change, and suddenly you have an explosion because business is wonderfully energetic and dynamic. If something works, people go for it. And that's what will happen in these materials replacements for plastic as well. There will come a point, and I can't give you a year or when that is, where actually the unit economics stack up, and suddenly not only do our brands want to replace the materials because their customers want, but there's no extra cost. So they will do it immediately. And suddenly you'll get a flip, and that will happen. I can't guess exactly when. It's not in the next few years, but it will happen.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think right now there are already more and more, there's already a lot more awareness, like we discussed, about the need to create materials that are biodegradable, compostable, and everything. But um, when you say there's a flip, do you mean also pricing wise, it will be much more affordable for the companies?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, at the moment, there are applications where our materials are cost competitive,
Mm-hmm.
and that's good enough starting point for us to build the business. And the PVOH market is about $400 million a year. That's a good enough starting point for any startup to access those sorts of market applications. But ultimately, plastics is a commodity business, and we and other companies in this sector, although the regulatory headwinds are in our favour, and there's a United Nations treaty being negotiated at the moment on plastic pollution. There's a whole series of EU and national government type level regulations coming through which work in our favour. Nobody should base a business on the risk of a government doing something and sticking to it. The real change comes when we offer things that our customers want and need that they can sell on to their consumers, and we're already at that point in a number of different areas. I think that the conversation about, well, is plastic so cheap that you can't compete against it, that was 10 years ago debate. I think that's moved on, and we know it's moved on. It's happening today, this transition.
Absolutely. Actually, another related point is I wanted to ask whether Sampla's plant-based substitute actually contains any plant material, like any crops or agricultural products.
Yes, so we can make materials from any plant protein, almost any plant protein
Mm-hmm.
from around the
Mm-hmm.
world. So our feedstocks at the moment are standard plant protein isolates. So these are standard commodity items. You can buy them on the open market. There are 23 million tons of plant protein produced in Europe each year, so that's quite standard. As we go forward, we're looking into more agricultural co-products, so waste from the agricultural industry, things that might normally go to animal feed or straight into anaerobic digestion and be treated as waste. Those are the sorts of crops that we can start turning into plastic. And ultimately, we have to think locally, and this is a very disruptive trend in a planet that's got quite used to 20th century globalization and long supply chains and standardization. But actually, what we want to do is grow crops locally, take the waste from those processes, process them locally, use them in local supply chains, and then plow them back into the same soils they came from at the end of life. And that's a circular and sustainable route to the production of plastic that is completely different from the existing 20th century oil industry attitude.
Oh wow, that's really impressive. Because the reason why I brought up whether Sampler uses plant-based agricultural products is because there is an issue where basically a lot of energy crops are, because of the demand, there are more and more energy crops, and actually that becomes almost contradicting, because then there's less space therefore for agricultural products, and it has affected the environment in a different way. But if, like what you said just now, Sampla is actually planning to create a whole circular supply chain and demand for the waste products as well, then that does solve the issue.
I don't think it completely solves the issue. I think there is. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Claudia. There is a very big issue here about, for the whole planet, about if we move away from an extractive model,
Hmm.
essentially drilling for stuff and taking it out the ground, into a circular, sustainable model, then the amount of land we have in under cultivation becomes a key factor, and so then it becomes a question of priorities. Now, broadly, this affects everybody. This is not just Xampla or even the plastics replacement. It's everything about biofuels. It's actually about everything about our future sort of growth as economies over the next sort of decades. It's a really significant point. What I would say is that there is a move away from meat, and meat is the most inefficient use of land that one could ever imagine on the planet, as sort of per calorie and so forth.
Yeah.
So that's going to disrupt all sorts of supply chains, including sort of farmer incomes. And as we move there, there's an opportunity for companies like Xampla to be taking feedstock that was directed to meat in terms of animal feed, growing cows, and use it instead in a much, much, much more efficient way to grow, to make plastic. And then there's also a whole bunch of other sort of crops out there which are not necessarily viable for food production. So again, it's one of those strange things that most of the calories on this planet are produced from five crops, from wheat and rice and so forth. Actually, if you start using your land more efficiently and start growing different types of crops, you can actually get much more diversity into the soil itself. You don't need to rely on chemicals and so forth, and there's much more output that is possible from that land. So there's a whole series of different questions that all are driven from that really big fundamental point of, what if in a century's time we're no longer drilling and extracting on this planet, we're growing everything in a sustainable, circular way? What does that actually mean for our whole production process?
Hmm. Yes, that's really interesting, the point you just mentioned, because I'm also very interested in regenerative agriculture and I've read a lot about it. And I know that a big part of that is actually using the technique of crop rotation to basically rotate crops every few seasons or every few months to make sure that the soil is naturally sort of nourished instead of having to use fertilizers and pesticides.
Mm.
And I think that that's a really good point, because that means that, I guess, um, that the products that Sampler uses isn't really just for your production, but can potentially contribute to other industries and the health of the
Absolutely.
soil in general.
Absolutely, and we've had conversations with farmers here in the UK. So we use a lot of pea protein, so
Mhm.
legumes are particularly good for us. Now, legumes are often grown as a cover crop, so they're grown in off season in order to nitrogenate the soil and reduce the use of artificial fertilizer. So it's a natural fertilizer in effect. Now, we've talked to farmers, and a number of farmers would grow that cover crop if there was some offtake, some revenue that they could generate from it, they would do it. But
Mhm.
at the moment, it's just easier not to, and to use synthetic fertilizers instead. So that's the sort of subtle place that we have in that circularity is, can we give those farmers a base load of income from their pea crop that they wouldn't get from growing for different functions, that would then allow them to reduce their dependence on fertilizer and to move, exactly as you say, to a more natural, circular, regenerative approach to farming. And this is something that we're thinking about, but it's something that everybody needs to think about, is this sort of one size fits all monoculture industrial agricultural approach is out of date now. It's not sustainable. It never was, and we need to think differently now about how we use not just our land but also our oceans and other
Mhm.
things on this planet. Seaweed is a really great crop. We can make things from seaweed, as can others in this sector. There are non-land based crops that are also available here.
Yes, I think working when it comes to a circular economy, we really have to work with the multiple stakeholders throughout the supply chain and have a conversation with the different stakeholders in order to even understand the gaps and then the opportunities, which is why I think it's what Sampler doing is amazing. I mean, you're not just talking to the corporates, the clients, and the consumers, but you're also talking to other members of the supply chain and suppliers to fill in that gap.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think that we're very conscious that obviously moving away from oil is important and necessary for this planet, but we can't create problems if we try and solve that problem. So we need to think in the round and avoid issues in the past where people have fixed one thing and then created another one.
yeah,
And I
yeah.
think you were alluding earlier to the issues about the biofuels. The first
Hmm.
generation of biofuels essentially were challenged and did not take off particularly well because of this question of land use and
Yeah,
fairness of land
yeah.
use. We need to be very sensitive to that across this whole sector as we move to essentially a bioeconomy.
Hmm. But when it comes to really taking action to create a circular economy, there are so many systemic issues, and I just wanted to talk a bit about what you think the balance of the government's role versus the business and corporations' role is. I mean, a business and technology can solve a lot, but it can't solve everything without the support of policy. Do you think right now the UK government is being supportive with their policies enough so that a company like Xampla can really step in to make a change?
Well, we're having this conversation at the moment where we've just lost a chancellor, possibly about to lose a prime minister. So policy is quite hard to talk about in Britain just at the moment. But at the bigger point on plastics, I think the role of government is to smooth transitions.
Mm-hmm.
It would be absurd to suggest that any government should be setting up taxation or regulation or whatever for to balance out for a long term this transition away from oil. But government does have a function in smoothing that gap. Now in Britain we have got specific single-use plastic legislation. We've got in Innovate UK an extremely good innovation agency that has got very targeted focus and support of innovative technologies and approaches coming through in plastic. And obviously at the EU level, we've got things like the ECHA microplastic ban, which is a very well constructed process for shifting all sorts of microplastic categories away from oil and into natural materials. And that's an example of good regulation and good legislation where it provides that transition. But ultimately, this is about brands and it's about consumers. And plastic people don't buy plastic by chance. It all comes back to consumers in the end. And if consumers turn against plastic and drive it, then that is actually the most powerful driver that any business can have is sales essentially.
Mm-hmm. I guess when it comes to consumers, because I believe Sampler is a B2B business, so you don't directly talk to customers or sell to customers. Not
Yeah,
customers, I guess consumers.
consumers. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, since this product or since the company has already been developing products for around 15 years, have you noticed, I guess, over the past few years, almost an increase in businesses coming to approach Sampler to develop plant-based alternatives, just because the
I,
the trend and the ESG trends as well as consumers are more and more pressurizing corporates to create products that are biodegradable and compostable.
Yeah, I just highlight that the science has been developed over 15 years, but actually
Mm.
Xampla's only been running since 2020. So
Okay.
the sort of product side and the commercial engagement is much shorter time frame. But
Okay.
yes, I would say even within the past 2 to 3 years, there has been a shift in attitude amongst the major brands, and not so much about the big picture. Brands have been talking about setting plastic reductions targets for quite some time, but more in terms of the practicalities of how they go about it is that 2 years ago we were having conversations with customers who were saying, well, here's our synthetic plastic. We need you to match on price, match on performance, match on shelf life. And if you can't do it, then we won't talk to you. That has moved on because that's obviously an unrealistic approach. Now we're having conversations with customers and buyers and procurement people and so forth, where they're saying, okay, well, what can we do that's innovative and exciting? What can we do to change the way we think about plastic? How can your material substitute in this area, and we can redesign our secondary packaging and so forth. So it's a much more sophisticated and nuanced understanding on the customer side of what is required to make this transition. That's the main change over the past couple of years, and that is only positive, and there will be more of that as we go forward.
Mm, got it. So, apart from creating plant based alternatives to plastics, which is specifically what Sampler has expertise in, I also wanted to understand your point of view in how, as corporates or consumers, what role we can play to curb the current plastics pollution crisis. Because right now, the rates of plastics production is still increasing and is forecasted to increase as well. So, is there anything that the government or businesses can do to mitigate this issue?
I think you're right. It is chilling that there is projected to be a massive increase over the next 20, 30 years of plastic production before the problem gets better, essentially. And we all know that recycling in its current form doesn't work. It's been trialed and developed over the past 20 to 30 years. Billions of pounds have been invested in it, and still typically countries only recycle about 10, 12% of the plastic that's produced. So there isn't one solution. Recycling has a part of to play in the future of our sort of whole economy and so forth. But actually, ultimately, the only real solution here is for brands and businesses to move away from producing polluting plastics and start using things that are natural. And to revert back to the point I was making earlier, is there is a tipping point on price and volume and capacity, and the quicker we can get there, the better. Because at the moment, an industry that wants to continue business as usual in terms of production of plastic can legitimately argue that there are all sorts of good things about plastic. It reduces food waste, it increases health and safety and hygiene and so forth. And therefore there is a downside to banning plastic or reducing plastic. But if we, and it, quite apart from the economics and the cost, but the moment we get to a point where you've got natural based materials that can deliver that safety, can deliver that convenience and function, but not damage the planet, then you're going to have an explosion in the production of alternatives to plastic, a very, very rapid transition away from those materials that require a systems approach. And that's the goal that we all, I think, governments and businesses and tech providers like Xampla should be working towards.
Hmm. Actually, on the point of health, it's very interesting that you mentioned plastics does, in a way, contribute to health in the sense that sometimes it's more hygienic. Um, but also, there are also debates against this issue, which is that, the microplastics in our water or even microplastics in tea bags that seep into the tea we drink, that's very detrimental to our health as well. And I feel like when debates center around health, it actually raises awareness more because consumers, whenever it directly affects them, they're more prone to take action. So, do you think the health argument against like saying that plastics are detrimental to people's health and wellness can help with people uptaking plant-based substitutes more quickly?
Absolutely. I think the argument in favor of plastic is one that somebody made to me relatively recently. They said I wouldn't go into a hospital without plastic. And
Hmm.
I think that is a valid point that, plastic has increased all sorts of, there are positive things about plastic, of course they are. And in 20, 30, 50 years time, there will still be plastic produced, but it won't be single use plastic. It'll be those kind of plastics that can only be provided by the function that plastic provides. I think the health arguments that you allude to are completely correct. I think there's no debate really about the impact on microplastics in our health. They're in our food system. They're now entering into human health. There's been evidence and studies of microplastics being found in human placenta. There's also, in addition to the microplastics, the forever chemicals sort of understanding has massively increased over the past 20 years. We recognize that you can't put these synthetic chemical plastics and chemicals into our food chain and into our environment without it causing direct harm to human beings. And that is already recognized and acknowledged today. So I think that case is strong. But at the same time, we all have to work with the world as it is. We shouldn't try and ban plastic tomorrow. That would be irrational. What we need to do is support and enable and ensure that a transition away from these polluting chemicals occurs towards natural things that cause no harm. And for us, like others in this sector, our material, you can eat it. It's so, it's literally a food. So it exists in nature. It's not going to cause you any harm.
Yes, thank you for that really good summary, Simon. I think that's really important for businesses to know what to focus on, because sometimes with all the news about like plastics being bad for the environment and health, but also being good for our health in another way is very overwhelming. And I think if businesses don't know where to focus and what step to take next, then sometimes they just stagnate, which is what we don't want them to do. And
Well,
just
and also without being cynical, Claudia,
Mhm.
there is an established industry here which has got a long reputation
Mhm.
of denying climate change, that is quite keen to deny the impact of plastics from a
Yes,
harmful side. So this isn't a fair fight, if I can phrase it like that. And I think that consumers are increasingly aware of that. And what we need to do is ensure that businesses have got options to move away. Businesses, you know, most businesses want to do the right thing. It's just quite hard to do it. We need, as tech
absolutely.
providers, to give them those solutions so they can make that choice easily.
Mhm. So just before we end, as a tech provider, if a business is currently sort of really wanting to transition to plant-based plastic substitutes, but they don't know where to start, what would you say to them?
I think plastics is a very, very big sort of space. I think the starting point for any brand owner is to talk to their existing supply chain. But instead of sort of letting the supply chain tell them what the supply chain is going to supply, to challenge them, to set some targets, to communicate their targets. A Unilever brand manager doesn't make plastic and is not an expert in plastic, but the packaging provider who supplies that brand manager is. So I think that's the sort of crucial sort of point. And again, the role of brands is a very interesting. You mentioned that we have a B2B model. We kind of have a B2B2C model here with
Hmm.
a couple of twists in it beside. The role of a brand manager in making this transition is not to solve the problem, but it is to come to a company like Xampla and say, okay, what could you do
Hmm.
if you were at scale? Let's create some prototypes, let's whatever, and then to take
Hmm.
that back to the supply chain and to say, look, this is what's possible, because this is what's happening right now. Is that not just Sampler, but a whole bunch of companies are making things possible that simply weren't possible a couple of years ago. So we
Hmm.
need to communicate that, and we need the brand people, the people who actually own the relationships with consumers. We need to inform and educate them to know what is possible today, right now.
Hmm. Yes, I agree with you. I think the first and key step to making a change is to first decide that you want to change. And I think once you make that decision, there are many options out there and many companies out there that you can work with to make that happen.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um,
absolutely,
so, Simon,
absolutely.
the last question I have for you is, what is a sustainable product that has inspired you recently?
Goodness, that's a question there. Well, I'm slightly sort of packaging and plastic obsessed, so I'm afraid it takes it straight into that sort of area. I tell you what inspires me constantly, and this sounds silly, but when was the last time you walked into a meeting room and there were plastic bottles on the table? And just think how quickly that's happened. Because in Britain now, everybody walks in with their great big, enormous reusable plastic bottle filled up with water from wherever.
Mhm.
That's a change that's happened within the couple of years, and that I find quite inspiring because it does show just how quickly things can change when everybody wants them to change. That's inspiring.
I agree with you as well. I think seeing that does really inspire me. Although nowadays most of my meetings are on Zoom, so I'm
Yeah.
not sure about whether plastic bottles are used behind the laptop. But when actually that is true, like when I have attended in person meetings, I rarely see plastic bottles, single use plastic
Yeah.
bottles anymore.
And
Maybe.
these transitions happen so quickly. I'm old enough to remember smoking in meetings, and suddenly that's not acceptable. And there's a whole
Mhm.
series of things that are societally normal and accepted until they're not anymore. And I actually think that plastic waste, plastic pollution, this is a serious threat to the social license of these companies to operate. This is a massive change, and it's happening right now, and that's quite exciting.
That absolutely is very exciting, and Sampla and yourself have played a very, very, and will continue to play a very important role in this. So, thank you for all the hard work that you have done and continue to do, and thank you for joining me in this Let's Talk Sustainable Business episode. I look forward to all of the projects and new products that you will launch, and yeah, excited to see what is next for Sampla.
Well, thank you very much, Claude. Thanks
Thank you,
for this
Simon.
opportunity.
Thank you very much. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Let's Talk Sustainable Business. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to our podcast series or explore the entire catalog of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at www.conference-board.org. If you have any thoughts to share with us, you can also email us at sustainability@tcb.org. Thank you very much.
That was Let's Talk Sustainable Business.